What it means to do streaming?
Yeah, so we go on to Facebook so that sometimes people choose not to come into our Zoom group, or maybe they wish that they were able to be free for Torah study, but they want to check in and learn from it later. So not all of the time, but most of the time, we put this on Facebook so that people can participate later.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing today. Hi, Sharon. Welcome. So today we are going to be looking at two different midot. Last week we were talking about tzedek, justice. And this week we're going to continue talking about tzedek, but we're also going to be talking about rachamim, which means mercy. So sorry. I have so many things on my screen that I've lost the one that I need. So I'm getting it up again. I apologize. And we're kind of talking about how it is that we can balance these two things, tzedek and rachamim, because they work together, but they're also a little different from one another. Here we go. Now I got it. Okay, does that work? Can everyone see that okay? Awesome. So why don't we start just by looking at this first text and trying to figure out what this means to us. Will anyone read it for us?
Well, I will, if nobody else.
Thanks, Jessica.
God has told you, O human, what is good and what the Eternal requires of you. Only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God.
Okay, thank you.
We're done? Just do this and we're done? Is that?
Right. If only we have the full gist of what it means, right? Oh. It sounds pretty simple. It's a little bit harder to actually do, right? So we have these two words that are kind of showing up here, mishpat, which is kind of akin to tzedek, justice, right? And then we have chesed, loving kindness or goodness. So when we read this text from Micah, how do we do this? What does this mean to us? What is it telling us? Jessica, if you have it figured out, we'd all love to know.
Oh, no. I would say that if you do these three things, then that must encompass everything else that's in the Torah, because Micah would not contradict what's in the Torah. So if you do these three things, you've done the other 610 or however many there.
Yeah, Cornelia.
Yeah, that's interesting. It also seems to me as if by making a definitive statement, or while making a definitive statement, this passage also raises questions. Like, how can you do justice at the same time as you love goodness? And why is modestly related to this? So I think that's interesting. The questions are implicitly raised in this passage.
Yeah, so like much like what Jessica is saying, right? These few words written so simply, they call on us to ask so many more questions.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully we'll be exploring at least some of those today. There's a lot more questions, certainly. Any other thoughts or comments on this piece?
The word in the Hebrew is to love chesed.
Mm-hmm.
Is goodness a translation for chesed?
In this translation, that is how they did it. And we are free to argue with that, right? Every translation is an interpretation.
So I think that when you read it, it has a very poetic and a very placid appearance. I mean, only three things, but if you think about it, it doesn't say that it doesn't say they're easy, that they're fun, that they do not carry many, many challenges, some of them good, some of them not so good. And that I think the first person said, if you put justice and goodness, there seemed to be a feeling that those things could clash. And when you start thinking of that, and to say that that's all that God requires of you, God never requires little alls.
Mhm.
God likes to challenge. God says, it isn't like, that's okay to go along your way. That's not the way it works. And to walk modestly with your God also.
Right. Sometimes it's translated humbly. In this case, they chose modestly.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that translation, but it's interesting. Because
yeah, and in this class, we've talked a lot about anava. We've talked a lot about humility as the starting point for all musar. And so it is kind of interesting that it's juxtaposing justice with chesed, goodness, love and kindness, however we want to translate that, right? And then in the end, going back to this idea of being humble in our path.
I would say the humbleness part is that you don't take the justice part personally, right? I don't want to take it so personal, because then I won't be just in the way that if I feel you wronged me, and if my ego gets involved, and my, all the other stuff. So I'm saying, I believe what I'm taking from it is that you do it humbly, because if you always take that, you want to put the retribution of justice on people personally, it'll get all messed up and mucky. So if you do it humbly and know that justice needs to be served, but not take it so personal, that's a good way of taking it.
it's also when you do something where you get really applauded for it, and you're so great and you're so wonderful, and won't you lead this troop or whatever it is, that God is here. We were able to do it, or the person is able to do it. In this, I would say that there certainly is a very strong belief in God. That's something we were talking about last night from time to time. And not to let yourself get carried away. You were really lucky. You worked really hard, and this thing worked really, really well. But there's still God. And God is still bigger than you, and God is going to keep asking things of you.
Beautiful. So it's not just the idea of humility at the end. It's also the fact that this is God's calling, and it's for something that is bigger than us. It's not about us. It's about a larger picture. So those are all really great contexts as we jump into some of these texts today. And I put together this text sheet a few weeks ago now. And as usual, I put way more text here than we could ever hope to get to, but we'll get to some of it. And whatever we don't, you are encouraged to study and to read and, continue to grapple with, and always to bring it back here. So let's move down to a piece that actually comes from this week's Torah portion in Deuteronomy. Any takers to read this? Okay, I'll read it if no one wants to. That's totally fine. You shall not turn over to the master a slave who seeks refuge with you from that master. Such individuals shall live with you in any place they may choose among the settlements in your midst. Wherever they please, you must not ill-treat them. So this is kind of a challenging topic to just jump right into, right? It's talking about the treatment of a slave seeking refuge from a master. Why would a slave seek refuge from a master?
A lot of reasons.
Okay, well, what are a few? We're not going to get all of them.
The way a person is treated, the way a person may be whipped, the way a person may not be fed, may not be cared for. I'm reading things about in that way right now in other You know, the master, he could have tried to get away and been brought back. You know, again, I have what's happened in the United States historically reading going on. So you don't turn somebody back to a place that is dangerous.
Well, maybe also just not to be a slave anymore.
Yeah, that is.
I mean, if you're treated really nicely, but you're a slave, you're still a slave.
That's right.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, Cornelia.
I think it's interesting to me because this passage kind of asks a lot. It's almost like a surprise that, first maybe you seem to be disrespecting a master in that first sentence. Then why should they live in any place? Wow, that seems like a big sort of opportunity for the just freed slave. And then you may not ill-treat them. So you have to remember that they're not slave anymore. You have to treat them well. So it's almost like this passage very quickly upgrades the status of the former slave. And it causes almost a surprise in the reader. At least that was the way I reacted.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't say specifically that they're no longer a slave. Although perhaps that ends up being the case, right? We don't really know. The Torah is not giving us a whole lot. But certainly there is this implicit respect that is being given to this individual that clearly was not felt before for whatever reason.
Right.
Absolutely. So I want us to look at this commentary. If I'm missing you, remember I can only see 4 people at a time, so feel free to jump in if I just don't see a hand or something. But I want to turn to this commentary right here. And in the Musar Torah commentary, it's Rabbi Bani Koppel who wrote this one. And she points to these verses and says, justice would seem to call for returning slaves, as one would return any lost property to the rightful owner. Now, from our modern point of view, no person should ever be another person's property. At that time, though, there was that thought of property. So that's why she's putting it in there. Yet in this case, compassion overrides justice. Justice may be blind. Compassion calls on us to see the other with open hearts. Always remember, we read, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. The rabbis depict God's struggle with the tension between justice and mercy in creating the world. With only strict justice, the world could not endure, populated by its imperfect human beings. On the other hand, if there were only mercy, no one would be accountable for their actions, and we would descend into chaos. Thus, the Midrash pictures the Holy One combining these two qualities of the act of creation. I should have taken out that last line because we haven't actually gotten to that Midrash yet, but we will get there soon. So, I mean, what do you make of the words of Rabbi Koppel here? What is she trying to point out?
It would seem to me that she's in the first line, justice would seem to call for returning slaves. That's if the law says you have to return them, and which is one interpretation of justice, that you administer the law in a fair manner. But on the other hand, even if it does say that, she's pointing out the other interpretation of justice. That means to be compassionate and merciful. So she's got them both there, I think, in this statement.
Yeah, last week we were told, right? Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. And we talked through the importance of having justice, of having these laws that all of us can point to, these larger understandings that we all live by and agree to in a sacred covenant with one another. But this is pushing that a little bit and saying, that's all well and good, but there are times where even that is not okay and compassion overrides it.
Well, justice, you have to say who made the rules. Who made the rules and what for and at what time and for what reason, and are they still valid?
And that can be harder to do when the rules are coming from the Torah, right? But are very important questions nonetheless. Yeah, Frank.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think that in Jewish law, back when we could have slaves, that we had to treat slaves so well that they say we become servants to our slave, if I remember that correctly. And so if we're not following that law at the time now, then that person is not our slave. He is not, we don't meet the standards for that person to be a slave. And I'm, again, going off the old rules that I comprehend, but that's no longer our slave if we're not following the laws of how we're supposed to treat our slaves. So I don't think that person is your property anymore. So I think everyone has the right to not follow that justice on that part, that we have to return a slave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Marla, did you have your hand up also?
I did, and then I took it down, and now I don't know if I want to put it up or not. I guess I want to push back or argue the point where it says compassion. In this case, compassion overrides justice. For me, that's a bit of a problem. I think I want to challenge the author of this to say, no, let's remember that compassion is a part of justice, rather than saying it's a this or a that. It's not a black or a white thing. But I would probably have a hard time arguing with this person.
Well, you have a point though, because when I was preparing for last week's Musar, right, I went through a lot of sources to look up tzedek. And the truth of the matter is that tzedek is one of the more ambiguous midot, because some people say tzedek means law. It means judgment. It means this is what it is and you have to follow it, right? Which would put it in contradiction with chesed. And that's needed. You need to have those laws and that strictness on one sense, right? But there are also modes of thought within Musar that describe tzedek much the same way that you just did, Marla. Of saying, no, tzedek is actually a combination of deen, of judgment, and of chesed. And so because of that, it definitely gets much more confusing. If this author is understanding tzedek as being straight law, right? Judgment. And so if we change that, if we go by that definition, I wonder if that changes anything for you.
Well, it does, because it puts a boundary or a limitation around his or her explanation. And I find that I lean more towards someone who respects the law, the rules, justice, because I do believe that leads to civilized behavior, and I think it's important. But then I want that person to have an understanding about the role that compassion can play. I think we used the example last week of it's a whole lot different if somebody robs a bank to get money compared to a mother who has no money and steals paper diapers from the drugstore. They're both wrong. You don't steal. That is a given. And yet, on the one hand, I think the bank robber should be disciplined. And I think that the mother who stole the paper diapers ought to be given some resources on how not to do that again. Maybe she has to get on some kind of assistance program or something like that. That's what I mean. I don't know if this person would agree with me or not. Maybe not.
I think she would. I think that's exactly what she's saying here.
Yeah.
Yeah, but thank you for bringing that in, because that clarity is important. Tzedek is a little bit more confusing within Musar, for sure. Let's go through a few texts. They're all a little bit different from one another. Right now, when we get toward the middle and end of Deuteronomy, it's Moses throwing a lot of stuff out there, a lot of laws, a lot of things to remember. And it sometimes feels a little bit like non sequiturs. What does this have to do with that? So I'm going to throw out a couple of very different texts from one another. But as I do, I want us to think about, like, what are the commonalities between them? What is the underlying message of these texts? So the first one, if you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your peer. If your fellow Israelite does not live near you, or you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it home and it shall remain with you until your peer claims it. Then you shall give it back. You shall do the same with that person's ass. You shall do the same with that person's garment. So too shall you do with anything that your fellow Israelite loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. Okay, that's the first text. And there's a lot just within that text right there. The next one is about the bird's nest. So if along the road you chance upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, and the mother sitting over the fledgling or on the eggs, do not take the mother together with her young. Let the mother go and take only the young, in order that you might fare well and have a long life. And then just one more quick text here. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. So if someone was going on the roofs, if it wasn't secure enough, someone could get hurt. So of all of these different texts, there is another one here too. I think we're going to skip that one because that's enough for right now. But these texts include laws about returning lost animals and garments, not taking the mother bird along with her young, building a safe and secure house. And then there was also a piece about leaving crops for people in need. And the question is, what do these laws have in common, and why do you think Moses is specifically listing them as he's talking to the people? Yeah, go ahead.
Looking at the first passage from Deuteronomy, it reminds me of, it seems to me that the text is urging an individual to stand in someone else's shoes, basically. That it's urging us to behave to other people the way we'd like them to behave to us. And that's kind of surprising. You take these animals back to your peer because that's what you'd like to have happen. Let's see. I think also there is a rule in Judaism about that if anyone loses property, you need to return the property to them.
Mm-hmm.
So this is also exemplifies that, but I think it also includes that rule maybe has its reason in this idea that of standing in someone else's shoes.
Yeah, that brings us back to some of the comments earlier, right? About the bigger picture. It's not about me. It's about something bigger.
Right.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts on this?
About that, what they have in common, at least 2, 3, and 4 to me seem to have in common that we're looking ahead to the future and protecting the future. Mm-hmm. So not taking the mother bird means there'll be more nests and eggs in the future. Mm-hmm. Building that safe and secure house means that nobody will be injured or killed, and so you won't be responsible or sued or whatever. And leaving crops for people in need is looking ahead and helping people so that they don't die or commit crimes like steal diapers or something because you've left stuff out for them. I can't quite reconcile that to number one yet, looking to the future.
I was thinking exactly the same thing, but then it flipped
I
for me.
wasn't done.
And
What?
I think if you lose an animal, you also lose the progeny of that animal. And if you lose garments, you could freeze to death. So it's not, we like, it seems smaller because you think maybe it's a calf who's running around or whatever, or the garment is not important. But shoes, covering, the use of your animals, not only that your animals work for you, your animals are also something you eat.
There is one piece that also appears as an extension of that first text that I didn't include here, which talks about returning an animal even to our enemy, right?
Oh.
So an additional way of looking at it could be the relationships that we build with one another, that perhaps there's kind of a long perspective as well in turning enemies into friends, or at least people with whom we can be cordial, developing meaningful relationships with people of support. My neighbor lost something and I returned it. I can perhaps rest assured knowing that if I lose my animal, my neighbor will also be there for me. And perhaps the children of my neighbor will be there for my children and vice versa and so on.
So that's paying it forward, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
So yeah, these are all kind of a bringing together in different ways of justice. All of these are laws. These are laws straight from the Torah, right? They don't always have reasons attached to them. In fact, they kind of rarely do. But they're laws, and in them, sorry, I realized that my phone decided to transcribe everything I was saying and was going to send it as a text to someone. So sorry. That all of these things are ways in which justice and also compassion in a lot of ways from what you're describing come together. They work in tandem. Yeah, Jessica, did you have something else you wanted to say? No?
No.
I thought I saw a hand, sorry. Let's look at this there's a couple of texts actually that I want to bring in by Rabbi Koppel here, where she says, as a military chaplain for 38 years, I observed firsthand the sense of dehumanization of the enemy that accompanied combat. We're raised to be sensitive human beings who would never think of taking a human life. When soldiers are thrust into war, it is challenging to overcome a lifetime of training not to cause harm to others. Sadly, they steel themselves for battle by seeing enemy combatants as other, and thereby overcoming a natural and admirable disinclination to kill. Traditionally, soldiers have achieved that emotional and moral distance by dehumanizing the enemy. However, there is an emerging understanding of moral injury as a foundation for post-traumatic stress. Moral injury can occur when there is a disconnect between our fundamental values, thou shalt not kill, and the reality that war entails, kill or be killed. And just one more piece here relating to the first. I recall the profound impact of Passover Seders in Iraq, where as we spilled a drop of wine from our cups, mentioning each plague, we reminded ourselves that we should never rejoice over the suffering of our enemies. The ritual of spilling wine from our cups is a reminder of the ultimate humanity of every individual, understanding the divine image even in enemy combatants. If we deny that reality, we risk moral disconnect. Any responses to this? Like, how does justice or compassion show up in what Rabbi Koppel is describing?
Rabbi, I just actually was kind of curious, isn't technically a more accurate translation of the commandment, thou shalt not murder.
Yes.
I guess because that feels like a pretty big distinction. Like I think many soldiers would claim they are not murdering. They're unfortunately doing a job that involves having to kill people.
Yes, that is absolutely 100% true. That's true. It's a different word in Hebrew. I think that this language is probably being used to show a point that even if it's not clearly it's not the same thing to murder as it is to kill in war, but perhaps it feels that way sometimes.
That makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead, Cornelia.
Yeah, I thank you. There's one thing about this passage that sort of bothers me is like an unanswered question. What if you take a soldier who's been trying to protect him or herself in order to be able to kill, and have him go through the ritual of spilling wine from the cups, for example, which reminds them of the humanity of everyone. That happens in the evening, and then the next day they have to go kill. I mean, I don't know what the conclusion of that question is, except that it in some way, I guess it almost seems cruel or tough on the soldier to have him go through that ritual. I don't know what people think about that. The reason for denying the reality of others was to make it easier to undertake the role of being a soldier.
Yeah.
I'm sort of what Cornelia, what you just said sort of reminded me of the Christmas truce in 1914 in the First War, where British and German soldiers, they heard each other singing the same exact Christmas songs. And somehow they got together and they traded food that their families had sent them. And someone had a soccer ball. And it was like a huge, amazing event that happened. And then the next day, their commanding officers said, you got to kill those guys. You can't stand around here singing songs and eating chocolate and drinking their wine. You've got to go and kill them. And I think it might have happened one more time later in the war, but things could have taken a very different turn in that war. Maybe, or maybe not, but it reminded me of that. Those young men had to the next day go out and kill each other after feeling this bond of humanity.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it would be so difficult on those soldiers, right? Because they're not the ones in control. Maybe it's the commanders who should be doing this, right? The people who make the decisions.
You know what this reminds me of, and this is a little bit of my activism, is the first part of this is where a lot of the men and women that are coming home from the military now are becoming police officers and bringing that same mentality of, everyone's an enemy combatant. If you're not part of us, you're part of them. And I believe a lot of that comes out in this, where, this is how we're trained. And then they were doing it in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now they come home and they're doing it to American citizens. So it kind of fits for me.
I think it's also because when you're going to war and you're being trained for war, part of that training is, thank God I have not had to be trained for those types of things, but how do you manage to even shoot people? It could be you. It's like live or die. It's that type of thing. And a lot of what we see with PTSD, which is just, again, is becoming much more known about, is then when you stop and you say, what if that had been my wife? What if that had been my husband, my son, my friend? And how to bring that in any kind of balance is, we do see the results of that. And we do see the results of some people harden themselves so much that they become, I would say, dangerous to themselves and others. But it's, I cannot imagine what that, and thank God I haven't had to imagine what it would be like to return from a war and be doing this part of the Passover program and thinking of what I had just done or done recently, or had even seen the results, because I may have been in a village where I went back through it again.
It takes a lot of desensitizing and in order to bring the person back.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the person doesn't come back. And if they do come back, they're an entirely different person. And familial relations are usually not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, as I said, they're usually an entirely different person. Sometimes they can have normal relations, sometimes they can't. And when they do come back, if it's done right, they're usually put in some sort of, I don't want to say isolation, but they're usually brought back, and they usually spend several months with an intense psychiatric situation with their unit, away from people, so that they get used to being back in the United States where it's safe. And they end up being with people slowly, so it's not what you're describing as this horrible situation. Some of them shouldn't be police officers. I agree with you. And I don't know why they have become police officers. I can't speak to that. But the situation that I am aware of, the person was brought back. They spent 6 months in a situation where they were desensitized, and he's doing much better. The familial relationship will never be the same with his family, but he is able to function in the real world, so to speak. He's held a job, a fairly high level job with a computer company as a consultant, has a child, and all of that stuff. So he is functioning, not what he was before, and he will never be the same. And he does have episodes, but he is functioning. And he will always have some form of PTSD, but it wasn't like when he came back. And it's just, it's a function of war.
Yeah, it's deemed to the extreme, right? Like sometimes war is necessary.
Mhm.
Sometimes it is. It would be wonderful to live in a world in which we could beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks, right? But we don't live in that world.
No. And
so when
you
that
know, we
happens,
are
what do we do?
doing better when we bring them back, because he chose to go back a second time. The first time he came back, it was horrific. Second time he went and came back, it was an entirely different situation when he came back. So the second time, I mean, we're doing significantly better than we did, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So that much I must say, we are doing better for the soldiers that come back and the officers that come back.
Comment.
Yeah, Irv, go ahead.
Okay. In the example they give, spilling the wine, we're recalling the sea closing on the Egyptians that were combatants chasing escapees. Well, just multiply that by a few. And what about people that kill people, not just collateral damage, but just kill people? They just drop bombs, or they do it from remote places now. What kind of trauma must they have? If it's one thing, you're killing somebody who's killing your colleagues and your friends. I think that's an easy transition if you're a soldier and been trained. But if you're sitting somewhere in an airplane at 30,000 feet and you drop a bomb and kill knock out a whole city, how do you even comprehend what's going through somebody's mind with something like that?
Well, what about the Einsatzgruppen? They were commanded by German officers, but they recruited men and boys from the villages that they killed. They rounded the Jews up, and
Yeah, but they were trained to consider those people less than human.
well,
And,
but ordinary people.
I know, but
did the shooting.
but the propaganda machine
Right.
had trained the Aryan people to think that they were superior and that the other people were not superior in the cause of all their problems. And so it was easy for them to carry out mass murder. Easier. I wouldn't say easy. Easy.
Yeah, and I'm just going to bring us back a little bit because there's so
Yeah.
much to discuss here, truly, and everything being brought up is so worthy of discussion. That Dean, this idea of justice, and can get out of control. It can, right? For the case of a soldier in war, dehumanizing the enemy might be the thing that keeps you alive while you're at war, right? Because if you hesitate, you could be killed. So that is such a unique experience in terms of like this conversation, right? And there are also times where outside of that context, someone can believe my way is right, other people are less than, I can do whatever I want. And that can be totally, totally out of control. And so what our texts are teaching is the importance of bringing compassion right into it. So that it's not just Dean, especially when there isn't imminent danger in that moment. I can't speak to what's needed while someone is at war, right? That people just got to get through, essentially, in those kind of cases. Yeah, Cornelia.
I was just really intrigued by the comparison between what it's like to fight in war and what it's like to be a police officer. I think that preparing for the role, preparation needs to be quite different. Thinking of what it's like to be a police officer today, the police officer has many more pressures on him or herself to be compassionate. No, Black Lives Matter, for example, or, you have to be starting to think about the justice of the compassion of what you're doing, that the other person as a human being. There's a lot of political, moral pressure on police officers now. And I think this discussion suggests that maybe part of the training for military people, soldiers who come back to become police officers should be focused on this. To help them really reverse the way they think of other people.
But it's not just soldiers who think of people that way, right?
No,
and I'm not
mean
saying
to,
that you're saying otherwise.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
I know you well enough to know that is not your intention in what you're saying. But yeah, I want to take us out of war for right now. That was one example very particular to Rabbi Bonnie's experience that she put in her commentary that I thought really was important for us to delve into because there's so much there. And Sharon, thank you for sharing so much of what you did too, to give that some context. I want to move to a couple of other texts. One of them is bringing in Alan Marinis because I can never do Musar without bringing a little bit of Alan Marinis into the conversation, who said, a world run only according to the principle of stern justice would leave no room for free will, learning, change, or growth, because every single time you did something wrong, mechanical rules would mete out results instantly without variation. To forestall such insufferable rigidity, God included the attribute of compassion as an essential feature of creation, right alongside judgment. It's not all rules. There has to be a humanity brought into it. There has to be this compassion in this relationship. And before I mentioned a midrash that we hadn't yet gotten to, this is that midrash. Would anyone like to read this out loud?
I can.
Thank you, Irv.
There was a king who had empty glasses. The king said, if I put hot water in them, they'll expand and break. If I put cold water in them, they will contract and shatter. What did the king do? He mixed hot water with cold water and put them into glasses. So too the Holy One of blessing said, if I create the world with the attribute of compassion alone, no one would be concerned with the consequences of their actions. With the attribute of judgment alone, how could the world stand? Rather, behold, I created with both the attribute of judgment and the attribute of compassion, and hopefully it will stand.
So a lot of the midot that we've studied, we've talked about having balance, right? You have too much humility, that's a problem. You have too little humility, that's a problem. We want to find a healthy place for that. With this, what we're being taught is if we understand tzedek as din, as judgment, as rigidity, right? It's not a matter of having the right amount of tzedek. It's a matter of having the right amount of balance with compassion. You lean too much to the compassion side, that's a problem. We lose all sense of rules. Everything is a free-for-all, right? We don't have a society anymore. You go too far to the din, the judgment side of things, and everyone is treated with such rigidity that our humanity is compromised. Yeah, Cornelia, go ahead.
I just wanted to say about something about using the word judgment and justice as synonyms. I think that's a problem. And particularly with Marini's, I think actually he has contradicts himself, because he says in this earlier passage that you quote, that judgment requires that everything be a specific way. It's like din. It's like the letter of the law. But in a later passage in Everyday Holiness, which I have studied, he says something quite different. He talks about judgment as a faculty for balancing opposed moral impulses. Like he says, executing the judgment of truth is preferable to adhering to an ironclad loyalty to the facts. So right. Judgment is actually a matter of applying and finding balance, like between din and rachamim. So I think I'm just saying one issue I think that confuses this text a little is that Marinius himself, I think, contradicts himself.
And that was true. And that goes exactly to what Marla was saying earlier, right? Is that of all of the different midot, tzedek is the only one that there doesn't seem to be an across the board understanding of what it means. Sometimes it means a balance of the two. Sometimes it means din, it means judgment. And because it's used interchangeably, it can be really confusing to understand exactly what's going on. So your point is definitely a fair one.
I'm sorry, I just want to clarify that I meant that there's a contradiction in the use of word judgment as if it were synonymous to din. Sometimes I was also focusing on Marini's use of the word judgment, sometimes to be synonymous to din, and sometimes to be something quite different, a process of finding balance. So I wanted to clarify that too.
Got it. In the Hebrew, the Hebrew word din can mean judgment, or it can mean, but it means them as synonyms. But the English language works differently. So yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions or thoughts on this?
I just
ready? Yeah, go ahead.
You sure? You can keep moving forward. Okay.
No, go ahead, Frank.
So, like, just to go back just a little bit, just the dehumanizing. To dehumanize someone is that you lose empathy for them. And injustice, when we lose empathy for another person, is we don't allow for others to make mistakes. And I think that's kind of the key, is to know that I make mistakes. They might have made a mistake, and sometimes we break laws mistakenly. We have so many city ordinances and that we make mistakes. And then to not lose that empathy that I also make mistakes, so not to look down on someone who just made a mistake. I think that's where we get that cross. So,
and isn't that exactly the theme of like where we are right now in terms of our Jewish calendar? Right, this is the month of Elul. Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchat Torah, there is this theme through all of it of teshuvah, of acknowledging that we are human beings, we are flawed, we make errors, right? But we have to believe that there is an ability to learn from our mistakes and grow from them. Otherwise, what's the point? If someone makes a mistake, and Frank, I know you're going to be talking about this on Saturday night, also about your own teshuvah. I'm so excited for that. But if someone makes a mistake and does something early in life, does that mean we write them off for the rest of their life? Goodness, I hope not, right? So, but if we stuck just to Dean, right, just to this idea of strict rigidity, then that's exactly what we do.
It also eliminates us being honest, right? Because if I don't ever want to be judged for my mistake, I'm not going to be honest. I didn't do it. But if I'm able to say I did do that, you know, so anyway.
Yeah. Looking at the time, we don't have very much, so I'm going to skip a few things here. Okay, actually, let's go right here. So this is from an article called Wounds Not Healed by Time by Dr. Solomon Schimmel that speaks a little bit to exactly what you're raising, Frank. And he says, it is my belief that the best balm for the resentment, rage, guilt, and shame engendered by human evil is the proper balance of justice, repentance, and forgiveness. Justice, which prescribes punishment for the offender, is essential for a society that wants to prevent hurtful behavior, assuage the emotional pain of victims, and try to repair and rectify the damage and injury they suffered. Forgiveness by a victim in response to repentance by an offender enables new, healthy, and sometimes even loving relationships to be forged between them. Often forgiveness can soothe our emotional pain and release us from anger and hatred, even if the person who injured us doesn't show remorse or can't repent, as for example, if he or she has died. Repentance gives us and others who have caused injury an opportunity to change, turn to the good, and help repair the physical, emotional, or material harm wrought by the misdeed. Repentance also greatly facilitates forgiveness. So bringing in this extra element here of not just the language used here, justice and repentance, which you can kind of connect, I think, to compassion, right? But also this idea of forgiveness, which perhaps is another form of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on any of that before? Or questions?
I have a tough time with the forgiveness part.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, it's I've read and heard where people who've been abused one way or another by a person, that they put down in writing, send them a letter, looking saying that they forgive what happened, and it just doesn't. That doesn't compute for me. I don't lean toward forgiving it. I'd rather have justice than forgiveness. But in the word justice is, justice and judgment. I guess judgment is the word. There's so many ways to set up guardrails in society. And if you don't have someone, when I grew up in the North Docks neighborhood, it was the rabbi. You go, two neighbors arguing, or if I had a problem with it, they would seek some wise advice from. They didn't go to the secular law first. They went to what was offered here, and but there was codificational law along the way gave some sort of guidelines, but there still has to be somebody who sits in judgment and who makes. There's never two winners. It's never. It's very rare where you may have a negotiation where you have win-win, but you don't have when it comes to being hurt or injured or dealing with those kind of issues, one person wins and one person loses. No one, and probably both of them are satisfied. So it's really very complicated. Very complicated.
Oh, it's definitely complicated. And you're bringing up kind of a scenario in which there's either forgiveness or there's judgment. What I read in this text was that there's an importance for all of these things simultaneously, right? That someone is held accountable for their actions. Saying I forgive you is not you're absolved, everything is good, there's nothing that you need to do. Don't worry about it. It's cool. Go ahead and do it again, right? Like that's not what it's saying. Rather, it's you're held accountable. Maybe you have to go to jail. Maybe you need to pay this back, whatever it is that the court decides. And in addition to that, perhaps there can also be some repentance and some forgiveness. Does that make any more sense?
Yeah, I think I can buy it if I can see the change and if I see how the person does truly repents and then acts the way in a positive way long enough to convince you, said, okay, what happened 20 years ago, that's old, that's old history now. I get it, forgive it. But to sit in the current situation,
Yeah.
What you see, and a lot of Christians believe this, that they are required to forgive somebody's sin, and they do it right after somebody did some really bad harm to them or their family. I forgive you. I don't. It doesn't compute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear that because we can't control whether a person really forgives and changes.
Right. That's true. They may find some solace in their belief system by doing that.
Right, and that's the thing, is that there is an understanding that we don't forgive because a person is deserving of forgiveness. We forgive because they don't deserve that space in our hearts and our minds. Like we forgive for ourselves. But everyone forgives on their own timeline in their own way. And I don't think it's appropriate ever to tell someone when and how they forgive, right?
I agree with that.
So it is 2:00 and I'm so sad that I don't have a chance to bring more of this in. There's a lot of really great stuff in here. All right, I'm going to have to find a way to bring in this brachot in a future Torah study because it is one of my favorite pieces, but that's okay. Another time, we have many, many more Torah study opportunities ahead of us. It's been so delightful to be able to go through this with all of you and that we can challenge one another and inspire one another. I know some of our friends weren't able to get on. I was getting messages from people while we were in here, so hopefully next time we'll be able to rectify that. But thank you so much. The only other thing that I wanted to bring up before we go, and I know I'm going over, so I apologize, is during Simchat Torah, we've been studying Musar this whole year, and I know that it really has been meaningful to a lot of us. And so when we're doing Simchat Torah, I had an idea that while some of our past B'nai Mitzvah are going to be chanting a little piece from their Torah portions or saying a few words about that, if there's anyone in this group who wants to pick a passage that we've studied in this past year and write like a paragraph about what you found meaningful to be included as part of our Simchat Torah program, let me know if you're interested in doing that. We can talk about that more. I just think there's so much wisdom in this group. And if you are in Oregon or if you're on the East Coast and you can't be there in person, you can participate too. Just feel free to write something out so that we can include your words or do it electronically perhaps. But if you have an interest in being a part of that, let me know because this has been really delightful going through this Torah cycle with all of you, and I would just love to uplift it. Maybe a few people will decide, you know what, I want to study Torah this year too, in the coming year. So just something to think about. I'll bring it up again. We do have about a month and a half before then. All right, well, thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day.